first year attending the university, I think, was the time where I realized I had something very different than everybody else around me. And then you realize how little people in San Diego know about the Kumeyaay tribes.
Civility means bringing as many voices as you can into our civic dialogue, even the voices we don't agree with. It's a simple adage. You want to get a good idea? Bring more ideas to the table. That's what makes democracy work. That's what makes free markets work. Possibly nowhere in San Diego history has that simple adage, a bunch of heads working together is better than one, been more blatantly violated than in our treatment of our indigenous peoples. When it comes to community and civility, the Kumeyaay peoples were once the community of San Diego.
That's right, the original indigenous people of the land.
And that changed, and with the new communities that formed, sometimes the Kumeyaay people were not as brought into the community as one might want.
Sure, that's right. There's actually a book that was written by Florence Chapek called Pushed into the Rocks, and that was kind of the historical term of, one day, many hundreds of years ago, there were Kumeyaay people in La Jolla, in Point Loma, in Old Town and downtown areas. Of course, there was a number of villages right there in Old Town, the Kasoy village, and a number of others that are actually at this point even underwater. So the Kumeyaay presence is historically there. The facts and the traces of the history are there, but since 1700s they've been pushed further east. So in some of the documentaries we talk about, living out a meager existence on the fringes of society, and that's definitely what has happened. So the Kumeyaay story of survival is really a story of survival.
Here we had a people who had lived for millennia sustainably across San Diego's diverse ecosystem, from desert to mountains to ocean and an arid environment. Marginalized and pushed onto reservations, their knowledge of sustainability was disregarded.
Our people have village sites that are carbon dated at over 40,000 years of continually inhabited in one location. And that's just a couple of sites that I know of. There's more sites. And so that kind of knowledge that comes with continually inhabiting a place that has the biodiversity that San Diego has is a wealth of knowledge that needs to be conserved for not just our local community, but worldwide.
Well, there's a rich cultural diversity from the ocean all the way to the desert. The one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the Kumeyaay were a great agriculturalists. There's stories and songs that tell us about whaling and fishing.
We should be embracing culture. Everybody has their foundation. For the Kumeyaay, we have our creation story. But others too should know their language and their songs. Because a key component here is ability to find out who you are and go share it, but most importantly, to receive that culture.
It's important to everyone to learn about the past of San Diego and how we can be stewards, good stewards in the future to maintain the high quality of life that we have here.
What lessons can San Diego relearn from our indigenous peoples about becoming a sustainable, prosperous community for the decades and centuries to come? We spoke recently with representatives of the Kumeyaay Nation. Kristie and Lorraine, thank you for being with us today on Keep It Civil San Diego. It's an interesting day to be discussing these issues, of course, Indigenous Persons Day. 2019 is actually the 250th anniversary of the arrival of the Spanish in San Diego. The Kumeyaay people were the original peoples in San Diego, and I learned, talking with you before the interview, that San Diego County has the highest number of Indian reservations, I believe, of any other county in the country. The Kumeyaay people are still a big part of our community. As members of the Kumeyaay Nation, in your experience, family and community, how do you reflect on the last 250 years, the way things have changed in unimaginable ways since the first peoples were here?
Well, definitely the past 250 years for us has been a testament to our people's survival. to our resilience and to our strong culture that has kept us intact. As you said, you know, we've been here way longer than 250 years. Since the beginning of time is what our stories tell. And science is catching up with our stories of being here. You know, science has proven that we've been here at least 17,000 years, but now we have a new discovery saying that there was bones found in San Diego that have been manipulated by humans over 130,000 years. So there have been humans here, and it's catching up with what our elders and what our stories have best passed down from generation to generation. We have always known that we've been here for that amount of time. And I think our culture has kept us strong and been able to survive 3 different cultures coming in and into the San Diego region and different waves over the 250 years. So for us, it's a celebration of survival, a celebration that we're still here, and just a testament to our whole community that we're going to, how important our culture is and how important our knowledge is that sustained us for over 100,000 years longer in the area, and that knowledge that we're still here.
Yeah, and building on that, Kristie, the knowledge base. San Diego as a region, like the rest of the country, has issues of overcrowding, overdevelopment, basic issues of biodiversity and habitat loss, and we have global warming, you know, which is complicating everything as never before. What lessons from the knowledge of the Kumeyaay people should we be taking, the people who have been here forever and know how to survive in the land? How can we apply that to our own circumstance in the 21st century?
Right. I think that it's a good time for us in San Diego to reflect on those things that you just mentioned. I really think that we're at a critical crossroads that to protect the environment, I think is the biggest value to San Diego. The more open space that our region is able to conserve has been proven scientifically that it'll stabilize our climate, and it will be assist in just having resilient resources here. Our resources are highest biodiversity, second to one county in Hawaii. And so California is a biodiversity hotspot, and it's one of the only areas in the developed world that has such a biodiversity hotspot. So it's really important that we conserve resources because it's a treasure for everyone, not just for us here in San Diego. We really need to conserve these resources. And I think that as we, as San Diego, appreciate what we really do have here, and people learn from us as well as other professionals of what the resources really mean to the world, I think that it'll gain more support, that there'll be more support for the conservation of resources in our region.
Yeah, and one of the issues there, Kristie, we talk in our institute about civility being ohana, family, no one's left behind or forgotten. That's how we always interpret the first 3 words of the Constitution. But that implies a multi-generational approach to how a civil community can survive. We've tended in an age of profit and capitalism, which produce wonderful things, to look very short term. The Kumeyaay people have looked really long term. How can we reconcile some of our short-term nature, like my generation taking everything we could get off the shelf, and still leave what we need for our children and children's children, so this is a sustainable place decades from now?
Very true.
I believe it's something that has to come from the community and individuals. I think as individuals, we have to make choices that are more conscientious of our footprint and what we're doing. Sometimes in some of my classes, I talk about how the Kumeyaay way was actually a positive footprint on the environment. Every action we did was actually to help and support and be a positive impact to our ecosystems. And we look at our species and resources around us as our relatives, so we take care of them that way. And so, like you said, ohana, and when you explained that was part of this program, that was one of the reasons I agreed to come and talk, because that is an important concept, and that's very important, and it has a lot of parallels to our way, to our Kumeyaay way.
Yeah, Lorraine, when you look at our modern system, there's this idea of ownership. You own the land, you do with the land what you want. But in traditional culture, there's a view of kind of, again, a stewardship that nobody owns it, it's in perpetuity. In your classes, as you teach, how do you try to get that thought across and reconcile what shouldn't always be necessarily contradictory, but often are those two roles?
Exactly. And for us, growing up that way and being taught, it makes a lot of sense when we look at it. You know, we moved, there was no ownership aside from, you know, certain areas where certain families were. And when it was time to harvest, you'd go to that area and you knew how much needed or what was the right amount to sustain that, to improve it for the following year, and what animals needed that helped sustain that harvest as well, and all those things that tied together. So knowing those things and allowing that to have a place and knowing our place within that too. Here in San Diego, the biodiversity, we didn't have like one certain game that was of our people. We there's villages that have been explored and studied that had 100 different species that we processed for food. And just because we think, oh, the deer or the bighorn sheep or something like that. No, it was, we took everything in balance and what was needed. And same with all the species. And we were part of it. We're not separate from it. So the same way we would do for our family is the same way we would take care of the environment and the animals.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great challenges of our time. How do you get the production we need to survive, but still think of that greater sense of family and all? And your own family's history in San Diego, I found quite fascinating. Kristie, you're telling me that your grandfather didn't become a citizen until when?
Well, our grandfather was born in 1898 in the San Pasqual Valley near Escondido, and that's where our reservation originally was from. And so he was, in 1924, I believe, that California ended Indian slavery, and they allowed Native Americans to become citizens. And so California was the last state that slavery ended, and it was Native American slavery. And so our grandfather was alive at that time. And so he didn't become a citizen until then. And then in '68 is when the Freedom of Religion Act was passed. And 1968 was when we were allowed to speak our language. And our traditional knowledge is held in song cycles. That way they never get lost. And so we have a very vast cultural responsibility to maintain those. And so after '68, we were able to actually do and practice all those traditional practices without being penalized, punished, and those types of things. So and that was part of the U.S. law.
And Lorraine, how do you work to maintain cultural knowledge in an age where culture gets overwritten by so many other competing factors?
So that's why I have done the work I've done for over 20 years at the tribal level and having education, because it's like anything else. Education, awareness, knowing your self-identity, those are all important things to our community. And because we're still here, it's vitally important for our young people, for our community members to know this, and there's been generations where that's been lost. So now bringing that back, we have community-based education where we have the language, we teach these stories, these songs are passed on to our young people. These songs, because there's so many and they're so vast and they can go on for days without repeating a song, and they are almost like, I wouldn't say it's a history book or a Bible, but it's traditional knowledge. It's a series of volumes of our knowledge. So passing that on and keeping that and making sure that our students have an opportunity to learn from our elders and learn from the last of the cultural knowledge keepers in our community. And we've done as a Kumeyaay Nation, there's 12 different tribal governments in San Diego County. And like you mentioned, across the border, they're also, Kumeyaay villages have kept their language intact, have kept our arts and tradition alive. And since we now have, on the other side of the border, we have more economic development for our community, we're able to have more resources to share and travel and visit with all the different villages and all the different tribal communities. And we've come together as a nation with the 12 different unique tribal governments, but all being Kumeyaay, come together and have consortiums and share our knowledge and have different types of education and historical preservation and cultural preservation that we can do as a nation.
Yeah, preserving history and culture go hand in hand. That's part of our social sustainability. Yeah, it was an interesting, preparing for our discussion today, I saw an interesting nexus because today is, of course, also Columbus Day. I come from an Italian-American family. I never knew the origins of Columbus Day. In the late 1880s, New Orleans, Louisiana, there was a big Italian-American immigration to work on the fields, but when Italian-Americans tried to unionize, you got backlash. There was violence, a sheriff got assassinated, it was blamed on the local Italian-American community. 11 Italian-Americans were lynched, and it set off anti-Italian violence across America. The Italian government threatened war with the United States, and Benjamin Harrison tried to defuse it by proclaiming Columbus Day. Fast forward 70, 80 years, Italian Americans, through this process of claiming a part of American history, somehow became white Americans with everybody else. They kind of assimilated. What's going to be required for the people who are here the longest to become more fully, not assimilated to become the same as, but to be seen as rightful equal members as other members of American society have become? There's no outside Indian government to intervene. What's going to be required to restore the balance of the Kumeyaay people in this area?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think you see that a little more, like you say, seen as equals, now that we have economic development, now that people are recognizing the tribal governments that exist in San Diego County, which really hasn't fully taken place. I think when that awareness becomes that how we're doing now, how your show is doing, building that awareness that we, the first peoples that have been here for hundreds of thousands of years since the beginning of time, are part of San Diego, and now executing, our economic ventures in the area and being able to have a voice and sit at the table and as equals with as sovereign nations and municipalities with city to city and nation to nation, have those discussions and be known that we're here and surviving and do want to contribute and do want to share our knowledge and our history and our wealth of history here in San Diego that goes on further than 250 years.
Yeah, and that becomes a good issue because as we want people to embrace each other's cultures, how do we keep, or when does cultural admiration become cultural appropriation? How does one show proper admiration of a culture without trivializing it?
Well, I think that when you brought up Ohana, the practice of Ohana, that makes a good point because that's the same here. And when you go to Hawaii as a visitor, you feel the presence of their culture, and I think that a lot of the things that we're doing, that we're working towards having that same, incorporating our culture and that same presence into our region, because that to us that's a more respectful way of presenting ourselves and our culture. So I think that we are doing those things to work towards that end. I think that the things that my sister is doing and the things that I'm helping do at Sycuan for Chairman Martinez, I think that we are working towards those goals. And I think that we just keep on this path. And I think that working with the city and the port and the county and all the municipalities, and to respectfully incorporate our presence of our culture into the community so that people can experience, the value and the treasure that Indigenous people provide in the region, not only here, but everywhere.
Yeah, and building on that, I'm going to ask the same question two different ways, inverted on itself. What was a moment that you personally experienced when you looked at people who were not of the Kumeyaay and said, they just don't get it? They don't understand who we are.
That's a good question. I think growing up on the reservation and being around our community, I think it took myself, until, well, maybe not that they don't get it, but that we have something unique that's so different from the rest of society. First year attending the university, I think, was the time where I realized I had something very different than everybody else around me. And I think that was, that contrast was apparent, which I didn't realize before, because, if you grow up in a community, that's all you know, right? And then you realize how little people in San Diego know about the Kumeyaay tribes, and how far and few information is out there for them to know to begin with. And all of our knowledge came within our families and passed down through our tribal stories and our tribal history, but the rest of San Diego not knowing and not having that awareness. And like Kristie said, this rich history that we're aware of. So that's, I think, why we both do the work we do.
And to look at it from a different perspective, or to turn it around, what was a moment when you thought people are relating, they are getting what it is to be Kumeyaay?
I think when we work with the youth, I think because that's always been a big portion of our focus, although we know we need, to fold everything else in, we've always made sure youth and education stays at the core of what we do. So I think that although we do have to, create that awareness in different places where we go, we also get motivated and inspired when we see young people. And so when we have school groups come through the museum in Sycuan, where I'm at, we talk to them, and I inspire the kids, and I say, I attempt to, and I say, we all have Indigenous roots somewhere on this globe. If you have a globe and every dot you touch, there's Indigenous people on that place. So we all have a root, and we all should honor that root, and knowledge of that culture that makes us special. We can contribute that can be our gift, and that helps us unite as people. And I think that's what's important as Indigenous people in Southern California. We're unique and amongst a lot of nations, and so I think that to spread that feeling of that connection and help it nurture it in young people, that's really important. That's something that you can't put a price on, and you can't really put words to even.
That on Indigenous Persons Day, I think that's my takeaway. We're all Indigenous people. We're all Ohana if you dig back far enough. And if we're going to be sustainable in the 21st century, we'd better darn well figure that out. Thank you for the lessons you provided us, Kristie and Lorraine. Thank you for being on Keep It Civil San Diego, and thank you for keeping it civil.
Thank you for having us.
Civil dialogue and politics can't just be about our side winning. Communities are about surviving. The more voices we can bring into our community discussions, the better the chance we'll get the good ideas we need to build the prosperous and sustainable San Diego we all desire. And until next time, keep it civil, San Diego.